I'm going to cover aspects of debate. So, as you all know, an MUN is not a debate, okay? Debate is a part of an MUN. So, as Pratham covered research, there's lobbying involved, there's diplomacy involved, there's research involved. So, a lot of factors come into play, right? I'm going to hold on one second. Let me try sharing my screen. Mm, Okay, one second. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Hold on. Mm, Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I'm gonna start with a question. What, according to you, is diplomacy? Drop in your answers in the chat box, or you can just like speak. And Harshit, if you can read the questions because I can't see the chat box.
Yeah, sure. Guys, diplomacy.
According to me, diplomacy is a third rasta to a very conflicting discussion which is going on. Do you know, simplify it? As in, if
Okay.
there is. Okay, okay, yeah, go on.
Yeah, yeah, continue. I'm listening. Okay, so you're saying it's like a third route that you take,
Yeah, kind of. A safer route, I'd say.
right?
To
Anyone
put
else?
forward. Yeah.
Okay, we don't have text.
Okay, cool. So basically, according to me, the best definition of diplomacy that I've come across is diplomacy is the art of letting others have your way. So it's when you know that you want something, and the other person, you convince the other person that what you want is what they want. So by default, what's happening is it's benefiting the both of y'all, but that person does not realize that this is something that actually you put in their head. Okay, so that is what I believe diplomacy to be, and it is an outcome of sound debate. Now I'm going to be explaining what sound debate means. I'll come to argumentation and all of that, and I'll cover that there. So one very interesting thing that you can notice is that not all good debaters are good diplomats, but all good diplomats are good debaters. Okay, so let me take like a case in point. So okay, the American Revolution, right? So if you see the picture on top, everyone knows Thomas Jefferson, right? So yeah, and at any point in time, if you all have questions, just drop it in. Harshit, you can read it out, okay? Huh? Cool. Yeah. So Thomas Jefferson is a classic example of someone who's a great debater and a good diplomat. Now, the other picture that I've put is that of Aaron Burr. Not a lot of people have heard of him, but he was one of the greatest orators and one of the founding fathers, along with Thomas Jefferson of America. So the reason why we don't really hear much about him is because he was just a good debater and not a very great diplomat. So what happened is when the two of them were competing for seats during the elections, most of the votes went to Thomas Jefferson. Why? Because he knew how to put his own interests and align it with interests of the other lobbied members. In fact, he was so good at negotiating that even one of his biggest rivals, Alexander Hamilton, who happened to be Aaron Burr's best friend, also ended up voting for Thomas Jefferson and not for Aaron Burr. So yeah, this was just an example of how you can be a good diplomat and a good debater. So another example that comes to mind is that okay, take for example a lawyer, right? A lawyer in the courtroom has to only take care of the fact that if you're the prosecutor, you take care of your stance and you defend and you have to attack the other person and defend your client, right? So in that case, you just have to care about the debating aspect. You don't need to be a diplomat. Now the same lawyer outside the courtroom, when you're trying to get a settlement in place, you have to be a good diplomat. So that is basically what debate versus diplomacy is. So now I'm going to divide debate into three categories. So to know how to be a good debater, you need to understand the shortcomings that that you might have when you're proposing an argument. So how do you know your shortcomings? By you have to know what logical fallacies people end up making. Now, even though this does not have a direct correlation with your MUNing, like in MUNs, you don't have a particular procedure to point out logical fallacies. However, you know that there is an executive board member who's judging you, right? So when you're making points, you need to make points that are valid and sound, okay? Because that establishes your credibility. Hence, you need to refrain from making logical fallacies or from having biases. And you also need to know how to construct and deconstruct your argument and your opponent's arguments. So let's talk about biases. So under biases, you have the Dunning-Kruger effect. So these are only a couple of biases, the ones that you come across most commonly. There are a lot of other biases which I've put in the next slide. You can refer to it once I'm done with the session. All right. So yeah, so the Dunning-Kruger effect is where we as individuals, so say I'm a company, okay, and I'm conducting a survey where I ask you guys that if you had to rate yourself based on your communication skills on a scale of 1 to 10, most of the people ended up scoring themselves on a scale of 1 to 10 to like 8 or 9, okay. Why is that the case when actually they were probably like a 5 or a 6? This happened because of the Dunning-Kruger effect, which says that people often tend to overestimate their knowledge and ability, even though they might not be that proficient. Now, there is a counter effect to this, which is also a part of Dunning-Kruger effect, where suppose I'm an expert in a topic and I know a lot about a topic. In that case, I start second guessing myself way too much and I underplay my ability. So I underestimate what I know. So both of these fit under the Dunning-Kruger effect. Now let's talk about the confirmation and the frequency bias. So confirmation bias is when you already have pre-existing notions about something. So you already have a few, you come from a school of thought, okay? Now, whenever someone's talking something, if it's in tandem with what you already believe, you tend to take in the information which confirms your pre-existing bias, which is why it's called the confirmation bias. So we only take in the information that we want to take in because we already have these biases. Frequency bias is related to the confirmation bias. It's a little different. So I don't know if you all have noticed. Okay, so let's take a case where I researched and I learned a new word today. Okay, now suddenly after I learned this word, I see it like when I'm driving my car, I see it on the hoarding above. I suddenly like it just starts appearing everywhere. If that's something that's happened to you, it happens to us a lot. That is not because the appearance or the frequency of the word has increased magically, but it's because we have started paying more attention to to that word. Like whenever we see a particular line, our focus is directly drawn to that line because we just learned the word. So that is frequency bias. Then we have, okay, wait, yeah. So then we have the self-serving bias, which is, as the word explains, it's something with which you serve your own ego, if I may put it that way. So suppose today I went and wrote an exam, and like I get my results, okay, and then I see that I've scored really terribly in that test. My self-serving bias is going to convince me to believe that because the teacher who teaches the subject is biased against me, that teacher doesn't like me, which is why he or she marked me and gave me like really low grades. So it's not my fault. We end up blaming the other person for our shortcomings. Okay, so that could be one way of seeing what the self-serving bias is. Then there's another way of seeing it. That is, if suppose I in the same test, if I would have gotten like really great scores, then I would pat myself on the back and say, hey, you know what? It's because I worked hard. That's why I got good scores. So that's in that case, I'm only focusing on myself because it helps my ego. And if things go wrong, then it's easier for me to blame another person. So that is the self-serving bias. Okay. Now, the curse of knowledge and hindsight bias. So, the curse of knowledge, as I was mentioning, was someone asked me, right, like, how much should I research? So, say you're over researched in a particular case. Now, for example, okay, let's take a case where I'm talking about Shashi Tharoor. Now, we all know that he's very good with words and he knows, like, he'll use all these fancy words and terms and it'll make everything sound cool. So, a person who loves long words is called a sesquipedalian. Okay. this is something I know. This is not something that you know. You're not aware of this word. But when I'm describing Shashi Tharoor to you, I'm saying that Shashi Tharoor is a sesquipedalian. So you don't know the meaning of the word and you have no idea what I'm talking about. So this leads to a communication gap. So this is when, and basically what you're trying to put across is not coming across to the person who you've intended your message to, right? So that is the curse of knowledge bias. So in this case another example could be, suppose I am a computer science student and I use like very fancy technical terms. So for me those jargons are very like it's very like simple, mundane, like I come across those terms every day, so I'm just assuming that everyone by default knows what it means. But that's not the case, right? You may not know what it means. So keep everything that you're talking about. What I'm trying to put across through this bias is that when you're making speeches in committee, it doesn't matter whether you're using fancy words or like big terms. And I really would discourage you from using, like I've seen a lot of these experienced delegates do this, where they just like quote random articles and charter articles, and like it really is not relevant. You don't need to. Sometimes it's good, you need to like show your sources and everything, but not all the time. So yeah. Then the optimism and pessimism bias basically deals with the fact that if we're in a good mood, then we tend to heighten everything that's positive, and if we're in a bad mood, then we're just like, if something bad happens that day when we're on a bad when we're in a bad mood, we're just going to be like, all the negative thoughts start piling up, and we're just like, oh my god, this is not going right, this is not going right, and then we just keep piling it on. So that is the optimism and the pessimism bias. Now, talking about the sunk cost fallacy, this is personally one of my favorites. So, the sunk cost fallacy is basically used, say, if you're someone who really likes trading, you're into finance. Basically, sunk cost means a cost from where you cannot recover further. So, suppose I've put some money in the stock market right now, and I know that the shares are declining, and it's been like uh, a week and the market price or the share market price hasn't gone up. Now what would be the wise thing to do? You know that the shares are only going to keep declining, so the wise thing to do would be to sell off these stocks because you don't want to incur further losses, right? But we as humans have this bias per se, where we don't want to be wrong, and we just keep holding on to this hope that, what, even though everything is going bad, maybe, just maybe, somehow the prices will magically just rise, and like I maybe might make profits and my losses might get overturned. But that's not the case. Okay, most of the times people who believe in this, they just end up losing more money in the stock market. So this is just like a small example of what the sunk cost fallacy can do to you. So to counter this fallacy, you must never dwell upon your losses, minimize your losses. Okay. And move on to the next thing. Don't keep dwelling on that. If something's not working out, leave it, go to the next thing. Okay. The negativity bias, not very important. Again, it's a mix of both the sunk cost fallacy and the optimism and pessimism bias. It focuses on like where you're just dwelling on the negative aspects. Okay. Now the decline bias. Okay. So the decline bias talks about how it stems from this philosophy which was produced by Socrates. So he was like a very cool philosopher back in the day, and he explained something called declinism. So the decline bias says that you have to. So suppose you're having an argument with your parents, right? Now your mom says that back in the day we used to do things this way, which is why even you need to do it this way. But you know that right now it's not relevant, right? Times are changing, right? But we as humans, a lot of times, we don't like change, and we just want things to be the way it's been going on. So that's called the decline bias, where the person does not want change and they just want to take whatever happened in the past as the Bible. But that's not how it works, right? So you got to be flexible, you have to be agile in committee. The backfire effect. Okay, this is like going to be funny. So suppose you are in the middle of an argument with a friend, okay, and you're just like, you both are at loggerheads. He or she is saying something and you're saying something. You're fighting. It's been 15 minutes and you're trying to get your point across, but you just end up realizing that the person you're arguing with is actually starting to make sense now, and then you realize, oh my god, what I was advocating is kind of messed up and it's wrong. But again, ego. So once that comes into play, you don't want to be the one to accept that, okay, I was wrong after, 10 minutes of dragging one argument that you're trying to build up, right? You suddenly don't want to let go of the entire thing that you've built up, because then you just might feel like, oh my god, that person's going to think I'm dumb. But sometimes it's okay to take a step back, to reevaluate, and be like, hey, what, maybe I misinterpreted what you were saying. Now I understand what it means. Maybe I should have seen it this way, and hence these are my points. So you can always do that even in committee, right? So yeah, don't hold on. It's not always that what I am saying is right. Sometimes you can be wrong, and it's okay to acknowledge that you're wrong. So yeah, now the fundamental attribution error. Okay, let me explain this with another example. So okay, yeah. So suppose I'm not trying to be sexist here or anything. Please, like, excuse me if it comes across as that. So suppose how there's this notion where we talk about women being bad drivers. Like, it's just something that's been associated, right? So that not all women are bad drivers, but because it's something which is like a general notion, you just attribute those, like, a bad driver to a woman, which is not right. So that is the fundamental attribution error. Okay, now the in-group bias. So the in-group bias is basically, we as humans, we form our own communities based on our preferences, and whoever matches our beliefs, right? We end up vibing with those people. So in-group bias is basically something that proliferates this belief where everyone who's a part of your group is always right, and if someone, an outsider, is trying to correct someone from your group, you will end up defending your friend even if you know that your friend is wrong. That's only because you have this bias that, hey, this person's my friend, even if he's wrong, I don't care, I will defend this person, and the other person, the third person, is just wrong. So that is the in-group bias. Okay, now the Forer effect or the Barnum effect talks about, okay, now if you are making a bunch of points and you're just seeing that the points are not adding up to the main conclusion, so what you do is, there are a lot of gaping holes in your argument. Now, because we still want to be right, what we do is we fill up these gaping holes of ambiguity with beliefs that would add up and that would make the conclusion more coherent. So there are holes, right? These holes are just being filled up by you. You don't know whether you're talking sense or you're talking crap, but you just want to fill the holes just because you want to get to a conclusion. Like, you don't care how you get there, but you just want to get there. So yeah, that is the Forer or the Barnum effect. Now that I've covered biases, like the main ones at least, let me go to the next slide. This is like a bunch of other
Like,
yeah, I just
sorry
want,
to interrupt.
yeah, tell me.
I just can I just go to previous slide again?
Yes.
Can you? Yeah. So, what do you mean by the backfire effect? Like, among all of these, there's only one doubt. Like, I don't know what is backfire effect. Can you give an example again? Like,
Yeah. So okay, now suppose you're saying something, I'm saying something, we get into an argument. It's been 10 minutes, we're arguing. There's been no consensus that we've come to. And midway through the argument, I just realized that what I'm talking is actually wrong. But I've already spent 10 minutes building up my argument, right? So how do I just like leave it? And how do I admit that I am wrong and you're right? Most people don't do that. They still want to hold on to their side of the argument. So in this case, it's backfired on you, right? Your own argument has backfired on you. That's why it's called the backfire effect. So in such a case, to avoid the situation, what I mentioned was that it's always good to acknowledge that you're wrong. It doesn't make you seem stupid. In fact, it's the smart thing to do, because now you've also learned something new. So yeah. Any other doubts before I move on to fallacies? Harshit,
no.
can you read
Thank.
out if there are any, or like someone can just like unmute and
No, there are none.
okay, cool. I will move on to the next. So this slide is basically for your reference. I'll send a better PDF in this. It's not very visible. The font is small. So these are like a couple of other supplementary biases. There are like millions of them. So yeah, just like read up on them later. Okay, coming to logical fallacies. So logical fallacies can be divided into formal fallacies and informal fallacies. I'm not going to delve too deeply into formal fallacies because you don't really come across them on a very general everyday basis, and it won't really be relevant, especially when you're debating. Okay, so formal fallacies, just know there are 4 types: appeal to probability, bad reasons fallacy, masked man fallacy, non sequitur. If you want, I will send another PDF which has examples explaining that. Since I'm short on time, I'm not dwelling into formal fallacies. Just remember, a formal fallacy is when the conclusion does not equal the premise. Okay, I'm going to come to what a premise is in a couple of other slides. Yeah, so let's talk about informal fallacies. Informal fallacies are the ones that are going to make or break your arguments. Okay, so there are 3 broad categories. One is the fallacy of presumption, fallacy of ambiguity, and fallacy of relevance. Now, presumption, as it mentions, you have preconceived notions, you have prejudices, you want to hold on to them, and your arguments end up being based on these presumptions that you already have about someone. So suppose I'm with a bunch of friends, and like my friends are gossiping about like a third person, and everyone's just assumed that this person, because he or she is not very talkative, is very arrogant. So that's a presumption that I've made. That person might not actually be arrogant. So in that case, like obviously in my mind, I'm going to be biased when I approach such a person, because I've already made up my mind saying, hey, this person's arrogant. So yeah, that is the fallacy of presumption. Then there's the fallacy of ambiguity, which again, self-explanatory. Any argument you make, if it leaves room for question marks, people don't understand, you don't make sense, it's not coherent, data is missing, it's ambiguous, it's random. So that's a fallacy. Fallacies of relevance. Again, relevance is, while this name could be a little misleading, right? It's not that all the irrelevant facts that you make are come under fallacies of relevance. It's actually to do with the fact that when you're arguing, you argue and you appeal to emotion instead of having it backed by facts. So most of the times I've seen this happening in like HRCs, or like where you need to draw into that emotional aspect. So yeah, a lot of times people end up indulging and focusing on the emotional aspect of your argument. Sometimes it works, but most of the times in other technical committees, this is not going to work. Please stick to your data, please stick to your facts. Okay, I've just randomly put it on the slide. It's called the red herring fallacy. In the next slide, I'm going to just cover some of the main fallacies. I won't be delving into all of them. You can read up further through the links that I'm going to give Harshit and Manaksh. They can forward it to you. So one of my favorites is the Strawman's fallacy, which basically says that this is something that lawyers do often. A lot of other people do this, like okay, so it's basically misrepresenting facts so that it just helps your case, even though you yourself know that this is not the case. But the way you produce it to the audience, you're misrepresenting it so that it just fits your narrative. So that is the Strawman's fallacy. Then I have the black or white fallacy. Very simple. You as a person, so schools of thought have been developing through ages, right? So we've had philosophers advocating monism, dualism. Monism is basically when you have one, everything is one, like and then dualism is when you believe it's either this or it's that, so it's either black or it's white. So you don't end up focusing on the nuances, like something like it may lie in the fuzzy region, but you don't want to delve into that. You just believe that if this is not true, then it has to be false. But sometimes when something is not true, it's not necessarily false, and vice versa. There could be a third route or a fourth route, which, as someone already mentioned, that in diplomacy sometimes you need to find the middle ground and take a third route. So that is the black and white fallacy. Then you have the ad hominem. Ad hominem, a simple case you can see is when US presidential debates, okay, like people get really personal there, where they just like start taking digs at each other and their own character traits and personalities. You see that in Indian politics happening all the time, where people go crazy in the parliament and they're just suddenly like getting personal. So that is ad hominem. Like, it's a logical fallacy because you're not sticking to the facts, you're just attacking the person. It doesn't help anyone. Okay, bandwagon, as it mentions. Okay, loaded question is again like when you just keep adding questions, and like you're trying to appeal to confuse people for your cause. So yeah, you're just like asking a bunch of questions which is full of rhetoric. Okay. Now bandwagon, again, as the name suggests, a bandwagon is when you have like multiple people following like one person in a parade. So okay, so bandwagoning is basically isne wo kiya, this person, suppose okay, I'll give you a very chill example, right? So my suppose my friend says that, okay, I want to do MBA from Harvard. Now I don't know much about MBA. I don't know what my interests are, but I just know Harvard is like a brand, and because my friend thinks it's a good place to do your MBA from, I also want to do MBA from Harvard. Then a third person who listens to me also wants to do MBA from Harvard. So it's just like, you're not thinking using your own brain to see whether or not it fits what your cause, but just because the other person's doing it, you just want to follow suit. So that is bandwagoning. Okay, begging the question is again similar to your loaded question, where begging the question is when you're making like circular arguments and you're not sticking to the point, and your conclusion is already there in your argument itself. So people are just getting confused and you're running in circles. So that is begging the question. Yeah, then appeal to authority is so if I'm making a point and I'm saying that, you know what, non-violence is a really good way to resolve conflict, and it always leads to independence. Okay. And how am I backing it? I'm just saying that Mahatma Gandhi is like a great leader and he believed in non-violence, and that is why you should also believe that non-violence is the best way to resolve conflict. Now these facts might be true, okay, but how am I proving it? I'm just saying that because some authority, like an authoritative figure, said it, because we look up to him, that's why we should believe it. But it's not always true, right? Like in your head, you might see someone as a great personality, but their thoughts might be skewed. So again, this is a fallacy. Appeal to nature, again, you're appealing to emotions, all of that. Then composition division, as it mentions, you're dividing your argument into smaller parts and you're just picking out parts, like cherry picking parts that fit your narrative. That's similar to your Texas sharpshooter as well, where you're picking out data. So if like you have a data space with like a lot of data, and then you're just picking out a small part of the data, even though that's not your major use case, it's just a small part of your data, but it's fitting your narrative. So you're just showing the audience that data, even though you know the majority of the data is not agreeing with that. So okay, those two I've covered. Anecdotal is again based on anecdotal evidence, that you're saying ki kabhi to kuch zamane mein this had happened, which is why this will happen again. So that is anecdotal. That's similar to your slippery slope, where you're saying because incident A happened and it led to Z and Z was bad, hence incident A should never again happen. So okay, now as I mentioned, ad hominem, there's tu quoque, which is basically, again, you're saying, when you get into an argument with a friend and then your friend says something and you realize that your friend is being hypocritical. So you're just like, okay, you're one to talk. So again, your argument is just that that person does the same thing. So like that person shouldn't have a say in it. So that is tu quoque, where you're just like pointing your finger at the other person. Appeal to emotion, I believe I've already explained. Are there any, wait, let me just, okay, personal incredulity, again, similar to tu quoque and ad hominem. Ambiguity, again, based on ambiguity. Genetics says that just you can decide the characteristics of something from its origin. Just because it comes from a certain place, it has to be a certain way. But sometimes, that's not the right thing to do. Middle ground, again, like it's like where you have to find a middle ground for the sake of it, even though the middle ground doesn't exist. That's when you resort to the middle ground. Okay, cool. So I've covered this. Then yes, okay, now I'm coming to the last part of my like this thing. So before I move on to the last part, do you guys have any questions as to like any particular fallacy you didn't understand? I'm sorry if I'm going fast, it's just I'm short on time. And one more thing, you don't need to remember all these fallacies at all. The reason I explained this not through definition but by through examples is so that you understand that in real life these things happen, and this is something that you should consciously keep in mind, that I shouldn't be doing all this and I should refrain from this. And if someone is committing a similar fallacy, I can correct them, and I can explain them why. Like sometimes just like go and be like, okay, this is what's happening, and that's how you can also resolve a lot of conflicts. Harshit, any questions in the chat box?
I don't see any.
I just wanted to confirm that you're going to send us the PDF of all these fallacies, right?
Yes,
As you
yes.
said. Yeah,
So
great.
I just don't believe in like putting a lot of text in my PPT, so I'm just trying to explain it, but I will definitely send the data as well.
Great, thanks.
Yeah. Now let's talk about argument construction and deconstruction. As you can, yeah. So sorry. Yeah. So as you can see, I've put Julius Caesar's picture in this. Now that's because I think I'm gonna send you guys a link to a YouTube video by Philosophy Tube. It's one of my favorite channels. If you're into philosophy, like go check it out. But anyway, yeah, so basically the reason I put his picture is because he gave a famous speech. Okay, so going back to the Roman era, where Rome, during the time when Rome was transitioning from being the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire, during that time there was this character called Catiline, and you used to have senates and consuls during that time, the entire like senate structure you had. So what Catiline wanted to do was that he wanted to dethrone the head of the council, who was I forgot his name. I think whatever, like some dude, okay. And he basically wanted to Cicero. Yeah, Cicero. Yes. So he wanted to get Cicero assassinated. So he sent a couple of his men to assassinate this guy, but the entire thing got foiled and it failed, which is why everyone in the council, they just got really mad that how can someone try to do this. And the three people that he had sent in order to execute Cicero were tried. Now, back in Rome, back then, capital punishment was not legal. So these guys were so angry that they wanted to behead all three, and they wanted to resort to capital punishment. Now, Julius Caesar, in his famous speech then, he was trying to convince the entire state as to why capital punishment is not an answer to the issue. And during the speech, he made a very long speech, but it was full of logical fallacies, which is why the end result was that they were actually executed. And while a lot of people still do not agree with capital punishment, but like his speech ka impact wasn't great enough to prevent that from happening. So if you have time, go listen to his speech. And in Philosophy Tube, there's this one guy who's deconstructed the entire argument and explained why why it did not lead to the result that he wanted it to. Okay, coming to the major points here. So I'm going to read out what I've written in bullets. So that is convert the sentence into standard form. Okay. So what I mean by standard form is that, okay, so if any of y'all come from a technical background, you probably already know what I'm talking about. So every sentence, you just have to label it, okay, sentence wise, label it as 1, 2, 3, 4. So when you're numbering the sentences, it becomes in a standard form. Then identify the premise or the premises. The premises is something which is a Roman word which gives rise to the word premise. The premise is basically each of your sentences which lay the foundation to your final conclusion or your argument or the inference that needs to be drawn. Now you use the divide and conquer algorithm. So what is the divide and conquer algorithm? Every labeled sentence that you have, divide those sentences and group them into categories, analyze those clusters in itself. Don't try to analyze the entire set of speech, because then you'll just get confused, because that's what the person's trying to do. He's trying to confuse you with all his or her logical fallacies. So you got to divide up your premises, and then from each of these clusters, you draw and you make mini conclusions. So you know that conclusion A, conclusion B, conclusion C. Now you see, do all these conclusions add up to one big conclusion? If yes, good for you. If no, then you know there's a contradiction right there. So you know that the ideas are not conjointly forming one conclusion. So there you already have your clue there that this speech is bullshit. And how do you draw inference now? So, okay, let's go to the next slide. How to draw your final inference. Now, there are two ways of doing this. One is your deductive reasoning and one is your inductive reasoning. Now, as I mentioned, when you've divided your sentences up into sentence 1, sentence 2, now you have sentence 1 and sentence 2, which you know They aren't facts, but they're just incidents that have occurred. And then from those two, we're making a conclusion three. So in such a case, when you know these are not facts, but when you know that these are not actual facts, but they're incidents, then you use inductive reasoning. However, inductive reasoning also applies to axiomatic expressions. Now, what do I mean by axioms? They're universal truths. Okay, so suppose I say that the sun rises in the east. This is something that we know by default, right? It's a fact. So in such a case, whenever if you're or say the earth is round, okay, like unless you're a flat earther, then I don't care about you. But anyway, so sorry, yeah. So that's when you use inductive reasoning basis some facts which are already established. So you don't really need to make your arguments, and you don't need to again build up the foundation to explain ki why is the sun rising in the east, because people already know that. So you just move on to the next thing, and then you use inductive reasoning. Now, how do you use deductive reasoning? It's when your line 1 and line 2 are both true, and you derive 3 from 1 and 2. So I'm going to give you examples to make it simpler. Now let's take an example of deductive reasoning. So line 1 says, all good men go to heaven. Line 2 says, X is a good man. So by default, you know that by transitivity, X will go to heaven. Why? Because X is a good man and all good men go to heaven. So that is deductive reasoning. Now, let's take another example of deductive reasoning, which is a little ridiculous. I'll tell you, I'll explain why I've taken this example. So, Indians love wine. Trump is Indian, so Trump loves wine. Now, logically, you don't see something wrong in it, but you know, factually, we all know that Trump is not an Indian, correct? So, in this case, even though you're applying deductive reasoning, your argument is still flawed. Now, I'll tell you what happens in such a situation. So in situation 1, where I've taken the heaven example, you know that your argument is valid, but it's not, it's valid and both sound, because you know, there is no factual inaccuracy there. Unless, yeah, let's not get into whether heaven or hell exists. I'm just like, it's just an example, okay? Now, now in the second case, you know for a fact that Trump is not an Indian, but I've mentioned Trump is an Indian. So in this case, because transitivity is being applied and logically it's fine, that's why the argument is valid, but it's not sound, because one of your premises is wrong, or like sometimes both your premises are wrong. So in such a case, deductive reasoning would be flawed. Let's take another example. Now, the third example that I have is of inductive reasoning, what it would look like, because I said it's based on incidents, right? So, Y had a bad day at work. Y could not enjoy the house party. So, why do you think Y couldn't enjoy the house party? The third line, the inference that we've drawn is that Y was in a bad mood because uska din kharab gaya tha during work. That's why when he came home, he couldn't enjoy the house party. But maybe that's not why he did not enjoy the house party. It could have been like maybe there was someone at the party he did not like. Even though he had a bad day at work, his mood had recovered. But then the factor that caused him to not enjoy the house party wasn't his work issue. It was because he had someone at the party who he did not like. So in such a case, your argument becomes flawed, because you really are just basing your argument based on an assumption which is inductive. It's based on an incident and not an actual fact. You haven't verified it. So yeah, I mean, this is how you know, and you can, you know, understand where a person is coming from. This is how you deconstruct arguments and you construct your own arguments. In the last slide, I've just put a simple algorithm for you to so basically how to check whether an argument is both sound and valid. What you do is if 1 and 2 are premises, doesn't matter if it's deductive or inductive.
This is
If
again
1 and 2,
source of knowledge.
huh?
What if these guys are commerce students? No offense, but or probably students have no idea of coding.
Because why I've not written a code, Harshit, I've written an algorithm. Algorithm is for everyone. Yeah. So yeah. So basically, if 1 and 2 are both true, don't see all this equal to and bullshit. Just listen to me. If both sentence 1 and 2 are true, then the argument is both valid and sound, as you've seen in the previous example. Now, if you know one of the premises are wrong, then the argument is only valid, but it's not sound. And sometimes, so you will obviously know if an argument is not valid or not sound. That is, if transitivity doesn't hold, then it's not valid. And if it's not valid, it will definitely not be sound. So Yeah, I mean, that's about it from my end.